Welcome to the Lekbest channel. It's Andre with you, and I'm glad to present you our new original story. Everyone knew this couple and laughed at them. The grandmother and granddaughter did everything together, lived together and went to work together. The grandmother was a cleaner at a medical center. She had no one to leave the girl with, so she took her with her. A funny little girl, about 6 years old. She approached her grandmother's duties very responsibly and believed that they should split them in half. After all, they do the same at home. The grandmother cooks dinner, and the granddaughter serves her the dishes, spreads the tablecloth, etc. And when the grandmother washes or irons the clothes, the girl helps fold them. And so it is at work. While the grandmother was washing the floors at one end of the corridor, the granddaughter was doing the same at the other. The mop was taller than her, and the girl comically dragged it around with her, but she got the hang of handling this tool. It was very funny to watch her try and puff, polishing the floor. It was impossible to pass by her without smiling. All the employees of the medical center treated this couple well. They greeted the woman warmly, and often treated the girl to candy or cookies. In principle, good relations between colleagues and management reigned in this center. Everything here was aimed at attention and care for people, and the management provided its employees with comfortable working conditions and decent wages. The work of an oncologist is associated with many difficulties. One of them is bureaucracy. Often you have to fill out a lot of paperwork, wait for confirmations and permits. A patient with a suspected disease is sent to various specialists, and the time spent on this can be decisive. Enormous moral stress, irregular working hours due to multi-hour operations, litigation as a result of a surgical error. All this is only part of the difficulties in the work of an oncologist. Here we can also add the lack of expensive drugs, as well as the human factor, when the patient must make a decision himself, and the doctor, although he understands the importance of the urgency of the operation, cannot influence him or change his mind, because in case of any unfavorable outcome, he will be blamed by the patient's relatives. Boris knew all this since childhood. His parents were oncologists. His father even taught at a medical institute. The boy observed how many hard things are associated with their specialty. And he also saw how people fade away, how difficult it is to fight the disease and how much grief it entails. Boria did not know what he wanted to be when he grew up. He did not have any special preferences. The only thing he knew for sure was that he did not want to follow in the footsteps of his mother and father. Their work brought sad thoughts to him. Subconsciously, he understood how important it is to recognize the disease in the early stages and have time to take the necessary measures. But his sense of empathy made him think about the possibilities of helping people with this. He still had to enter a medical school. His mother insisted on this very stubbornly. She was a very authoritarian person. During his studies, the guy was very involved in social activities. He showed leadership skills. He could organize the educational or work process well. He knew how to negotiate well, respecting his partner and acting in the interests of mutual benefit. After completing his studies, Boria got into a medical center, which, among other things, was engaged in preventive examinations of entire organizations. There, in addition to his main activity, the young man also had to perform the duties of a manager. He quickly learned that the contracts that organizations and the medical center sign are intended to grant access to work rather than to identify some disease. He categorically did not like this. He understood that he himself would have organized the work of the center completely differently. A short time later, a revolution occurred in the medical center and the management changed. Now the center was one of the branches of a large medical company. The rules became stricter, the established order began to change, and many employees quit, not wanting to rebuild their usual life. Boris, on the contrary, stayed. He liked the new laws. He found them correct and fair to patients. He was immediately noticed and given the opportunity to demonstrate all his qualities as a leader and diplomat. The CEO of the holding himself, an elderly man, spoke with them. He spoke for a long time. The young man talked about the conclusions he had made while observing his parents' work and how he himself would like to build the process. The elderly man listened attentively. His experience suggested that this guy had a great future. He was smart, honest, quick-witted, and made the right decisions. In addition, it was clear that he cared about his work. There was no candidate for the position of executive director yet, and the man decided to take a risk and give this position to Boris. His business quickly went uphill. Everything came together by itself, without much effort or stress. This always happens when a person gets to the right place. Now the center's activities were not related to treating people. They were engaged in diagnostics, conducted research and examinations of patients, gave permits to work or, on the contrary, prohibited them due to identified diseases. To put it simply, the work of the center was characterized by the beautiful word screening. Here Boria was able to develop to his full potential and implement all his plans. He was doing exactly what he thought about so much in childhood. He helped people quickly and without bureaucratic red tape identify diseases, if they existed, and begin treatment at an early stage. And he also still became a manager and did his job competently, with full responsibility. Nevertheless, it was a business, and it was growing. Boris realized this over time. Years passed, he continued to do his favorite thing and develop it. The center he managed was in the best standing and enjoyed the most positive recommendations, and the CEO tipped him as his successor. Boris's personal life was not so successful. He had a couple of more or less serious romances. One almost ended in a wedding, but at the last moment everything fell apart. Just before the altar, the girl changed her mind. Boria worried for a while, but then decided that everything was for the best. These were not real feelings. It was as if he was obliged to connect his life with one of these girls. They even seemed similar to him. He looked at his friends with their families and thought that it was time for him too. But his greatest love was truly his work. He was devoted to this lady to the tips of his nails and was ready to do anything for her. In his center, the man created the most comfortable conditions for both employees and clients. High-quality service, the skill of experienced medical workers, attention and care. Boris was very proud of the fact that none of his employees rented housing. He helped everyone somehow solve the housing issue. His man considered it one of the most important. There was another indicator of the well-organized work in the center. His employees went on maternity leave with enviable regularity. This fact has long been a favorite topic for jokes. Although deep down, Boris believed that where there is no growth and favorable conditions, children are not born so often. Boris recently took the post of CEO of the company. In principle, this fact has changed little in his life. Except that there was a little more responsibility. But it did not weigh him down. He continued to do his job. From time to time, the man attended various medical congresses and conferences as part of his job. And now one such event had been organized. He needed to fly to the small town of Bergamo in northern Italy. This trip arose suddenly, and he was still thinking about whether to change his plans. But the invited speaker was too important a figure. Boris wanted to meet him personally and ask some questions. So he put everything aside and flew. The conference turned out to be exciting, and the speaker was a very interesting person. The man did not regret for a second that he came here. Olga, an Italian translator, was with him almost all the time. She was recommended to the man at the hotel where he was staying. She was a pretty girl with shoulder-length blonde hair and attentive blue eyes. Olga was really good. She knew her job well, she transported quickly and accurately. She was not nice and delicate at all. Sometimes Borya involuntarily lingered his gaze on her. He liked the way she smiled, the way she involuntarily adjusted the light strand of hair falling on her forehead, the way she moved one shoulder from time to time. 5 days flew by in a flash. The conference was over. The doctors were going home, but he wanted to stay. He wanted to spend a little more time with her. Unexpectedly for himself, Boris realized that he had fallen in love. He suggested that Olga see him in person, not on business. She thought for a moment and agreed. They spent a week together. She turned out to be fabulous for both of them. Olga was 10 years younger, but despite this, he was very cozy with her. They always had topics for conversation. They both liked spending time together. She, too, was carried away by the man, and it was not his money that contributed to this. The couple spent a lot of time walking and talking. They shared their personal experiences and their thoughts, confiding in each other their most intimate secrets. And in the evenings they returned to their room and stayed together until the morning. They understood each other perfectly. Boris was already thinking about how to develop their relationship further. He did not want to lose the girl. She told him that she had been living in Italy for several years. She came straight after college to do some practical training, and that was how it had remained. Her mother, who works as a teacher, lives in Russia. Olga was not going to stay here for long and was planning to return to her homeland, but later. She liked her work here and wanted to continue doing it for now. That evening was especially pleasant. They had dinner at a restaurant, walked along the brightly lit streets of the city, and admired the scenery. The big moon illuminated the mountains in the distance and smiled kindly at them. The future turned out to be wonderful and exciting. Boris was thinking of staying for a couple more days to spend some time together and have a serious talk about what would happen in the future. He was already mentally making plans on how to persuade her to return to her homeland with him. And although the girl had been staying in his room for the last few days, that night she decided to go to hers. She said that she had some kind of strange feeling. She wanted to be alone with herself, to sort herself out. He didn't insist, didn't want to pressure her. The next morning he called her, but she didn't answer. After several unsuccessful calls, Boris went to the girl's work, but she wasn't there either. He couldn't find her or get any information about her. The nimble and talkative Italians were constantly moving somewhere, talking loudly among themselves. Nobody paid attention to Boris. The company was in a bustle. Everyone was rushing about their business. And he felt out of place. He was standing in the middle of the corridor, people were flowing around him from both sides, and no one was paying attention to him. In the end, the man managed to grab one person by the sleeve and ask him questions, but the Italian didn't understand him and sent him to his boss. The boss was sitting behind the closed doors of his office at the very end of the long corridor. He understood Russian very poorly, asked again many times and seemed to be thinking about something completely different. But Boris did not back down, and as a result of their long conversation he understood that Olga had flown home to Russia. Unfortunately, he was unable to get any details. This boss could not really explain anything. From his words, Boris understood that in the middle of the night, Olga had received a call from the hospital where her mother had been taken in serious condition. The girl was very scared and took a ticket for the next flight. That was all he could find out. Boris started calling her, but the phone only answered with long drawn-out gutkas. He did not know her last name or the city where her mother lived. He called her non-stop for half a day. In the afternoon, Boris returned to the company where Olga worked and again forced himself on the boss. He asked permission to leave a letter for the girl there, in which he gave all his information and added that he would wait for her and really hoped for the continuation of their relationship. At this time, the boss was devouring huge pieces of pizza with great appetite, taking them out of an oily box. He nodded graciously, promised to fulfill all of Boris's requests, and then, carefully peeling his fingers, carefully took the letter and put it in the top drawer of his desk. Boris was very upset. He was worried about Olga, wondering why she wasn't answering. Maybe her mother was in a really bad way and the girl was going crazy with grief. He could support her and be there for her, but why didn't she call him? If only he knew, they could have flown together. Most likely, she just panicked, because the call rang in the middle of the night. That's why she didn't think to contact him. But be that as it may, there was nothing else keeping him there. He also bought a plane ticket and flew to his city. The man dialed Olga's number all day long, but he only received silence. Time passed, there was no news from her. Boris continued to call the girl, but still received no answer. He tried to contact the company where Olga worked, but at first they could not understand for a long time who he was talking about. And then some man, terribly mangling Russian, said that they did not have such an employee. He still made attempts to find the girl, but everything was in vain. Gradually, her image melted away. All this now seemed like a beautiful fairy tale. Boris threw himself into his work and thought about Olga less and less. Another fact contributed to this. Boris recently signed a contract with a partner company. Everything seemed very profitable and convenient. But then several months passed, and unexpected problems arose. The partners sang sweetly and promised mountains of gold. I wanted to believe them and do business with them. But when it came to the issue of distributing funds, they suddenly presented such a bill that Boris was stunned. They wanted almost everything the center earned and even aimed to take it away. In general, they turned out to be bandits, behind whom competitors were hiding, coveting a successful businessman. It was a difficult time. He got out of it with great difficulty, but he defended his center. The support of the team helped a lot. People loved and respected their leader and were there for him in difficult times. This incident taught Boris a lot and at the same time pushed personal relationships into the background. 7 years have passed since then. Boris no longer thought about Olga. Women appeared and disappeared in his life. Relationships with everyone were smooth and unremarkable. For the last 2 years, the man had been having a sluggish affair with a woman from another medical center. They met periodically, and he was not going to change anything in this relationship. Several times he thought about breaking it off, but everything went by itself, and he never got around to it. He thought that their affair would soon fade away smoothly. On this day, Boris was especially careful about getting ready for work. Today, a delegation would arrive representing new foreign partners. They were going to invest in Boris's business and open a network of similar medical centers in their home country. This cooperation had been maturing for a long time. The man was not ready to give a quick answer. He scrupulously weighed all the pros and cons until he made his final decision. The offer was very profitable for foreigners. It was the entry of domestic medical care to a new, higher level. For Boris, this meant expanding horizons and attracting new companies. Remembering the events associated with the criminals, the man prepared for this meeting very carefully. There were long negotiations. Everything was checked and rechecked many times. He personally dealt with the documents so as not to miss a single detail. As a result, Boris was satisfied. Everything was fine, there was nothing to complain about. Today he would sign the last documents. They had been sent to him by email in advance and translated into Russian. The partners insisted that they had to be in a foreign language. Otherwise, there would be difficulties with their local bureaucratic services. Boris had two of the best translators working for him, who drew up the contract in Russian for him. He left the house a little earlier than usual. He did not want to rush that day. He had to be collected, attentive, and there might be traffic jams on the roads. He wanted to avoid this. There were no traffic jams, and Boris quickly covered most of the distance. A little before reaching his center, the man decided to have breakfast in a cafe. At home he only drank coffee, and a long day lay ahead. It was unknown when he would be able to have lunch. There was a nice cafe along the way. Boris liked it there very much. From time to time he had breakfast there. The cafe's wide windows offered a view of the park across the road. Now, at the beginning of autumn, when the foliage on the trees acquires its exquisite coloring, the view was especially beautiful. Yellow, orange, burgundy leaves fluttered slightly in the wind and, swirling softly, fell to the ground from the spreading branches of poplars and maples. The cafe itself was very cozy. The waiters were polite and attentive, and the cuisine was simply amazing. In addition, at such an early hour there were practically no visitors. This also contributed to a pleasant breakfast in peace and quiet. He still had plenty of time ahead of him, and Boris settled down at one of the tables. Apart from Boris, there was only one woman having breakfast in the cafe. She was already finishing her coffee when the man placed his order. He glanced at her only briefly. The waiter took Boris's order and passed it on to the kitchen, then politely leaned toward the woman. He would not have seen it if the woman had not suddenly cried out. He looked up, and for a second Olga's forgotten face appeared before his eyes. It was as if he had plunged into the past. For a moment, all the forgotten feelings flared up in his chest. This woman reminded him of her in some way. Maybe it was her light shoulder-length hair or the color of her eyes. He did not know. But it was certainly not her. This woman was clearly older, about the same age as him. The woman was feverishly rummaging through her purse. The waiter waited patiently with a welcoming smile, watching her actions. Her face frowned more and more. Boris became interested, and he peeked in her direction from under his tie. Here she began to take some objects out of her handbag. On the table in front of her there was a comb, mirrors, a powder compact, keys and other small items. "There's no wallet," she said in a deep voice and looked at the waiter. "I never forget it. I don't understand how this could happen today." Quote. A slight shadow passed over the waiter's face, and his smile became a little less wide. "Let me leave you a deposit, and I'll bring the money tonight after work. I feel very uncomfortable. Such an idiotic situation." Apparently, this option did not suit the waiter, because he shook his head. "What should I do? I really will bring you the money. I'm not lying." Boris was already looking with curiosity. It was not a fact that the woman was telling the truth, but the waiter controlled himself very well and did not allow a scandal to flare up. The dialogue between them was repeated. She offered a deposit, he refused. Boris watched for a while, he was amused by this scene, and then decided to intervene. Today he is in a good mood. Let others be so too. "Let me pay for your order," he turned to the woman and added, turning to the waiter. Anything can happen. The woman's face was already slightly flushed. Now she blushed even more. Please leave me your phone number. I will give you your money back. Oh, come on, Boris waved his hand. It's a small amount. It's not difficult for me to help you. No, you can't do that. The woman insisted. He gave her his phone number. The woman left in a hurry, probably already late, and Boris started his breakfast. He felt a little satisfied with himself. After all, he had done the right thing, like a man. He had helped a woman out in a difficult moment. And what if she turned out to be a liar? No problem, he had still made a nice gesture. 5 minutes later, he had forgotten about her, and his thoughts returned to the upcoming signing of the agreement. The delegation of foreigners was led into the assembly hall for its signing. It was a large room with a high ceiling, decorated with ornate stucco. Its vaults were supported by majestic columns in the corners. The building itself had been built in the previous century, and its offices, once the bedchambers of wealthy gentlemen, bore traces of a bygone era. In the center of the room stood a large oak table, and high armchairs were arranged around it. No outsiders were allowed to approach the room at that moment. The ban extended to everyone except the secretary, who was supposed to serve tea to the guests. These partners were Italians, there were 4 of them. The Russian side was represented by Boris, his assistant, and one of the translators. However, his work had already been done, and he was here only as a simple formality. Both sides walked into the room across the shiny floor. It had only recently been washed with special care by a woman and a little girl. The woman, like the other employees of the medical center, had no time to be interested in what would happen behind the wide doors. They had received orders to stay away and they followed them. But the child, on the contrary, had a burning desire to find out what would happen there. The girl tried to get closer all the time. Katya, come here. That's not gray hair, quote. The grandmother grumbled at the girl. The girl approached her, and then, having found a moment, disappeared again. She, in principle, was a very active and inquisitive child. Then the quiet clicking of heels was heard, and the secretary showed up with a tray. She was heading for the doors. According to the agreement, they were only supposed to be closed so that she could enter. Then she would close them tightly herself. But the doors were closed. Someone entering last did it for her, and the woman realized that it would be difficult for her to enter. Her hands were busy with a heavy tray with cups filled with hot tea. She hesitated for a second, thinking about how to cope with this task, and suddenly saw a curious face peeking out from around the corner. She smiled. Well, of course, the girl wants to know everything. Katyusha, the woman called in a whisper. Pull the door handle, but so that you are not seen. The girl happily did at request. She pulled the door towards herself, hiding behind it. And when the woman stepped over the threshold, she couldn't hold the heavy door and abruptly let go of its handle. The door slammed shut, lightly hitting the secretary on the back. The tray in her hands shook, the cups swung, and tea from them spilled onto the floor. Confusion arose. Everyone looked at the woman. She became embarrassed, muttered something about a rag and rushed out. Katya continued to stand behind the door. Why did you slam the door so abruptly? The woman whispered. Bring the rag quickly, I spilled my tea. The girl flew like an arrow after the rag. The woman followed her, but she couldn't keep up with the nimble child on her heels. Katya had already forgotten about the ban on entering the hall. She knew one thing. She was at fault, and the situation needed to be rectified immediately. With a rag in her hands, she burst into the hall. Secretary, she was shouting loudly at her back, but she didn't manage to stop her. Now a little girl with a large rag in her hands appeared before the delegation. She fell to her knees and began to vigorously scrub the floor. The Italians looked at this masquerade in bewilderment. Boris couldn't even imagine such negotiations in his worst nightmare. Anger was pounding inside him, and his hands began to tremble. Just before this, he had taken the documents, which, in principle, were already familiar to him. Trying to stop the girl and throw her out of here, he abruptly waved his hand. The movement was awkward, and the papers fell out of his fingers. They fanned out on the floor, and one sheet ended up right in front of Katya's nose, who was on all fours. Suddenly, the girl stared at the paper and began to read in Russian. She didn't pronounce all the words correctly, confusing the stresses and distorting them, but the general meaning was clear. This was so surprising that everyone present froze. It was silence, and only a thin voice slowly translated what was written. Boris already knew what the girl had managed to read. This text had been compiled for him by translators. But then the girl read something that couldn't have been in the document. She couldn't have made it up. A child wouldn't have heard of such words. Boris looked up at the Italians. They shrugged their shoulders in surprise. Their eyes darted around. Come on. Boris leaned toward the girl. He was no longer angry with her and handed the paper to the translator. He looked at it carefully, then tensed up, read it again and answered. This clause wasn't in the contract. It had only just appeared. The foreigners suddenly hurried and were about to take their leave, but Boris's assistant had already called security. This matter needed to be thoroughly sorted out. They sorted it out until the evening. A small paragraph was added to the document, which had been read by Boris and the translators several times before the meeting began. Based on the words printed in it, the medical center was completely transferred to the possession of a complete stranger. People. The Italian delegation turned out to be a dummy. Once again, dishonest competitors were hiding their faces behind them. It was a carefully planned move. First, gain the complete trust of the holdings director, and then, at the very last moment, add a couple of sentences to the text. They will be completely unnoticeable against the general background, but will qualitatively change the meaning of the agreement. It was a monstrous violation of the rules. Certain services were engaged in the Italians and competitors. An investigation began. A case was opened against the criminals. The day turned out to be crazy. Boris had to call somewhere all the time, talk to someone, explain something. He thought about how stupid circumstances helped save his center. A closed door, a nimble girl, and he was still angry with her. I wonder how she knows Italian so well. He will have to ask her grandmother and be sure to thank them. In fact, the girl saved him. If she had not seen this small paragraph, he would have calmly signed everything. After all, the papers had already been read more than once. And then goodbye, his beloved brainchild. By evening he felt as if he had run a marathon of several dozen kilometers. This day had been very eventful and long. Boris was just getting into his car, intending to go home, when his phone rang. He looked at the number that had appeared. It was unfamiliar, but he had to answer. Most likely, it was for the department that had started. Good evening, a pleasant female voice rang out. We can meet. You helped me out at the cafe today. He didn't understand anything. What cafe? And why would he meet someone? The woman began to explain, and he remembered. Well, of course, It was in the morning. It will turn out that it was so long ago. So many events had fit into this day. He didn't want to meet. He was tired and generally dreamed of quickly stretching out on the couch at home. She insisted. Boris thought about it and agreed. Well, what can you do if it's such a day? He'll have a quick talk with her and go home. They agreed to meet at that very cafe. The woman immediately began to give him the money she owed for her breakfast. Boris refused and said that she owed him nothing. Their squabble seemed somehow stupid, and he laughed. Let's go into the cafe. Why are we, like schoolchildren, arguing on the street? I invite you. He kindly suggested. He suddenly felt cheerful and light. He didn't want to go home so much, and this strange day was just as unusual and worth ending. The morning waiter served them. He looked at them with bewilderment. Apparently, he recognized them right away. The woman's name was Nadezhda. Boris decided that it was impolite to have dinner with a person without knowing his name. There were quite a few people in the cafe now. They had to lean closer to each other to hear the words of the other. The conversation began with itself. Their communication was simple and relaxed. They sat in the cafe much longer than Boris had planned. He didn't want to say goodbye. He was really enjoying himself. Nadezhda worked as a clothing designer in a small studio. She told various funny stories and comically copied clients, but she spoke about it kindly. And cheerful fireflies lit up in her eyes. It was obvious how much she loved her job. Boris also talked about his, but kept silent about his position. For some reason, he decided that he shouldn't brag about his high position. Then he walked Nadezhda home. Already saying goodbye, she remembered her debt, which Boris never accepted, and again began to give him money. He even got angry and unexpectedly asked for her phone number. She was taken aback, opened her mouth, closed it and dictated the number. He businesslike wrote it down in his phone and wished her good night. On this ambiguous note, they parted. The next day was also stormy. The investigation was in full swing. The suspects were detained. Work was in full swing. Boris was constantly distracted, and he could not get down to his immediate duties. Having failed to get down to them, he went to look for Katya's grandmother to find out where the girl knew Italian from. She was found nearby. She was wiping dust on the windowsills, and the girl was spinning around nearby. She looked at Boris with fear and quickly disappeared into space. And the woman just grinned, looking after him. I wanted to know where Katya knew Italian so well from. Yesterday she did me a big favor. She was born in Italy and lived there until she was almost 6 years old, the woman answered simply, and then sadly added. She lived there with her mother. There was something in her words, but Boris did not understand what exactly. He wanted to clarify the details with the woman, but suddenly changed his mind. Instead, he returned to his office, invited the head of the HR department and asked her clarifying questions. She explained in detail that the cleaning lady's daughter died in Italy in an accident, and the grandmother took her to her place. The girl has only been living in Russia for a few months, but she knows the language well. Her mother taught her this. When the girl was brought, the woman was forced to get a job, and her pension was not enough for both of us. Quote. So she came to us, added the head of the HR department. Boris kept thinking about what he could do for them, how to thank the girl. In the afternoon, he saw her again. She was in the company of a huge mop. The girl was scrubbing the floor with it and drinking something under her breath. Boris went up to her and started talking. He carefully chose his words, afraid to hurt the child by reminding her of her mother. Quote, "Where did you live, in Italy? Do you remember the name of the city?" The man asked. "I remember. Bergamo," the girl answered timidly. She was still waiting for what she would get, a scolding from her strict boss for her actions yesterday. Her grandmother had threatened her with this. She had been suffocating and scolding Katya all evening that she couldn't do that. Because of her philandering, her grandmother could lose her job, and here was a good income. Where else would she find one like that? And how would they live on then? Boris noticed that the girl was nervous and didn't torture her any further. Instead, he brought her a large chocolate bar. In the evening, he called Nadezhda. It turned out that she was still at work. Urgent order. "I'll have to stay late," the woman sighed. Boris offered to take her home later. Quote, "I'm still at work too. I can stay late. There's something to do." She was happy and gave him the address of the studio. He drove up when she was finishing work. The studio was located away from the noisy street, in the middle of a quiet alley. Its wide windows were brightly lit, and the blinds were raised. Boris got out of the car and watched Nadezhda doing something, sitting at the table. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not notice anything around her. But then she finished. Satisfied, she leaned back in her chair. A smile played on her lips. Then she glanced at her wristwatch, jumped up and quickly began to get ready. The woman threw on her coat, grabbed her purse and turned off the light, and a minute later she appeared in front of him. That evening, Boris did not invite Nadezhda anywhere and only drove her home. But he wanted to do this, and it was nice to feel her next to him. At night, he dreamed of Olga. She was as young and fresh as then during their affair. In the dream, she smiled at him and tried to say something. Then her image began to change, and Nadia appeared in her place. Boris woke up with disheveled feelings and with the feeling that something important was coming. Shock after the stress he had experienced, connected with dummy investors, gradually passed, and Boris began to think constructively. He firmly decided to improve the living conditions of Katya and her grandmother. To do this, he needed to get to know them better, which he did. The man once again had a conversation with the head of the HR department. This time he asked very specific questions. As a result of the conversation, he found out very interesting facts. Katya's mother worked as a translator in Italy, and the girl's grandmother had taught at school in the past. The girl did not have a father, at least no one knew about him. Teachers' pensions are not so high that they could raise and develop a child. After the death of her daughter, this concern fell on the shoulders of the woman. The more the head of HR reported, the faster Boris's heart beat. Soon he could no longer listen and ended the conversation. Kodrovichka left, and he sat, hugging his head in his hands, and whispered, "This can't be, it can't be." What happened then seemed like a fairy tale. She liked him right away, from the first day of their dating. Olga didn't dare think that they could have something serious, but these thoughts kept spinning in her head. And then he asked her out on a date. Their feelings were mutual. How happy she was. They spent a week together, almost never parting either day or night. She took a few days off from work. She wanted only to be with him. On that terrible night, she suddenly decided to go home. It was as if something was pushing her. She was woken up by a call from the hospital. Her mother had an attack. Her situation was very serious, and her life was hanging by a thread. Olya almost went crazy with worry. She couldn't think straight from her sleep. Already approaching the airport in a taxi, She thought that she should have told Boris. Maybe he would even have flown with her, but it was too late. The ticket was bought, and the flight would be announced soon. Having heard the terrible news, she immediately rushed to buy a ticket. The next flight was at night, and tickets for it there were still. Olya immediately placed an order and rushed to the airport. During the flight, she was beside herself. Thoughts about her mother tormented her, and thoughts about Boris flashed among them. While the taxi was taking her through the streets of her hometown to the hospital, the girl called work. She completely forgot that she needed to notify her superiors about her absence. The people on the other end of the line weren't very alarmed. "You don't have to rush, I understand everything," the boss answered calmly. "You'll handle your business and come back." Despite the fact that she was thinking only about her mother, Olya was surprised. He was speaking so calmly. Perhaps he didn't understand the full importance of her problem, or he didn't care why his subordinates were absent from work. She wasn't going to figure it out, because she had already encountered more than once how different the mentality of Italians was from her native Russian. The girl jumped out of the taxi almost on the move when they pulled up to the hospital. She ran inside as fast as she could and, already in her mother's ward, realized that her phone was not with her. Olga didn't even remember whether she put it in her bag after talking to the boss or not. In any case, it remained in the taxi. She hoped for some time that the taxi driver would somehow find her. But her hopes were in vain. With her mother, everything turned out to be not as bad as she thought. At first, the woman really did have an attack, but everything turned out well. The young nurse on duty at night tried very hard to do her job as best she could. She exaggerated a little when she called Olya. Mom was discharged after 3 weeks. She was already feeling well and was soon going to return to work at the school. She was very upset that her daughter had to be so nervous, quit her job, buy an expensive ticket and fly here. Olya said that it was not scary. The main thing was that her mother got better. But now her thoughts were only about Boris. She called the hotel and found out that he had rented out the room the day after she disappeared. Apart from his phone number, they had nothing in common, and it was lost. She did not know the man's last name or address. The hotel room was booked for him through a certain service. It was impossible to track Boris's data there. A little over a month later, Olga returned to Italy. Her boss greeted her with open arms. Olya was appreciated at work and waited. Several days passed, and the boss remembered that some strange Russian had left her a letter. Hope flared up in the girl's heart with renewed vigor. When the man took the letter from Boris, he accidentally left greasy stains on it. At first, he put the letter in a drawer, but then he took it out and turned it over in his hands. "I wonder what that Russian wrote here." He thought about it, twisted the envelope in his fingers, and then accidentally squeezed them. The letter was crumpled. He thought that he should put it back in its original form, but then he got a call. He urgently had to leave on business. The letter was left on the edge of the table. A little later, an elderly woman who was cleaning the premises came into the boss's office. She knew that he always left his lunch wrappers on the table. The woman opened her garbage bag, folded it and put in it an oily pizza box, a couple of greasy napkins and some crumpled paper, which also had greasy stains. The boss returned in the evening. He forgot about some letter. He had his own very specific concerns. The letter was not found. Olya could no longer stay in this company. It was not that she was very offended by the boss. It was just that every day she thought that the thin thread connecting her with Boris had broken here. It was excruciatingly painful to think about it, and soon she moved to another company. And then she found out that she was pregnant. She did not know whether to cry or laugh. Fate had cruelly laughed at her or given her the memory of her beloved man. Of course, she did not doubt for a second. The child was wanted. So they lived together with their daughter. Olya named the girl Katya. At first it was hard. Alone in a foreign country with a baby in her arms. But there were kind people who helped them. She also had friends, not many, but good, kind women. The last couple of years Olga was fond of mountain climbing. They had their own close-knit group lovers of mountain air and peaks. During one such ascent, the weather suddenly deteriorated and a hurricane-force wind arose. The travelers lost sight of each other. The bad weather lasted for a long time. People found themselves at the complete mercy of the elements. When the hurricane finally began to subside and visibility improved, they slowly began to gather together. Many had serious injuries, but they were alive. Only 2 did not survive. They were buried under rocks. One of them was Olya. Quote, "If someone knew that you came from the same city..." The woman sighed. Boris cried when he listened to her mother's story, but he was not ashamed of his tears. That evening, he asked to visit Katya's grandmother. The woman was shocked, but tried not to show her surprise. The director showed up at her house with 2 bags full of groceries. There were sweets, fruit, a delicacy and something else. She did not even have time to look, because he immediately began to question her. He asked to show a photo of her daughter. Boris did not need to look at it. He already knew for sure. He just needed to see her again, to remember everything, to relive those happy moments of his life. He did not doubt that Katya was his daughter. Of course, later he would get medical proof of this, but that was just for the sake of it. He was going to take them into his house and make them his family. Now the woman would not have to wash the floors from morning to night. He would create the best living conditions for her, and he would take care of his daughter himself. He already loved her and made plans for the girl's further education and development. He will do everything to make her grow up to be a happy girl. There is still much ahead of them. A little later, when the feelings subside, he will tell them about hope. Boris really hoped that his family would want to accept this woman. It was not for nothing that he met her on the very day when his own daughter saved his business. Quote, "My daughter, my family," the man thought with pride and smiled. Family, what a sweet native word. Andrei was with you. Thank you for choosing me. We have been writing stories for you for 4 years now. We will be glad to see you back on Legbees for new emotions. All the best.